So a few weeks ago, we didn't have a speaker, and I sort of jumped up and started talking about one of my great avocations in life. Talk a bit about myself, and as you remember, I have a background in languages. I'm fluent in Latin, I'm fluent in ancient Greek, I can read Hebrew, I'm fluent in French, I can read most of the Romance languages. Ever since I was a little kid, I've always been interested in being a priest. I went to the seminary, the Catholic seminary for high school and college in Detroit. And actually my interest theologically back then was liturgical theology, sacraments and worship. But over the years, I sort of moved from that and more into scriptural theology. And my interest in the scriptures, I have an interest theologically, but because of my language background and my humanities background, I've always had a really solid interest in how did the New Testament as we know it come to be? How did it get written? Who wrote it? What can we know about the communities at the time in the first century church? So that kind of leads to a discussion as to what are the Gospels and who wrote them? How did they come to be? Now, as I said before when I talked, I have no intention in this talk to offend anyone in their spiritual sensibilities. I am talking as an academic. I'm not talking as someone of faith. Although the scriptures are documents of faith, they are not documents of history. But I'm interested in approaching them as historical documents. How did they come to be? So just to recap a little bit what I said before, most scholars today see in the first century 3 periods of development. So between 30 AD and 110 AD, there are 3 periods of development. So there's the period when Jesus, was on the earth, was preaching, was talking, and so he had a group of followers around him most of the time, and he had a large impact on large numbers of communities. So he spoke. The societies back then were not written societies; they were oral societies. So people listened, stories developed, and important things got remembered. After Jesus died, there's a period of time, so let's say from about 30 until 70, so about 40 years, when oral traditions started to arise, to remember when he said this, to remember when this happened. And as the missionary activity of Paul and Barnabas and Luke and others moved out throughout the Roman Empire, certain stories became important to remember. Others fell by the wayside. The Gospels, as we know them, represent the 3rd period of development. And most scholars today, and trust me, there is no unanimous consensus on any of this. We look at the preponderance of scholarship and where they fall currently. So the preponderance of scholarship today sees Mark's gospel as the first gospel to actually be written down. So why does Matthew come first in the canon? That's a different story. I'll come to that in a little bit. But we see Mark's gospel as the first gospel. Now, Mark's gospel was probably written around 70 AD. And it was written in Rome. Now, a couple of events that are very important to understanding why this gospel got written and how it is structured and what its theological message is. The first event was the persecutions of Nero in Rome. Nero started persecuting the Christians around 64 AD. So between 64 and 69, there was the first major persecutions. This was the period in which Peter and Paul were both in Rome. They were both martyred during this period. So the church in Rome, in a small community in Rome, was under a great deal of stress, obviously from the persecutions. The second major event would happen back in the Holy Land. In 70 AD, the temple, the Jewish temple, was destroyed. The Romans, there was a rebellion in around 67, 68. The Romans brought in their legions from northern Syria and pretty much wiped out Palestine. Ended up surrounding Jerusalem. It took over a year for Jerusalem to fall. When Jerusalem finally fell, the Romans came in and pretty much murdered everybody in the city. Men, women, and children, gone. And then they destroyed the temple. They burned it, and then they tore it down rock by rock. This was a major, major event in the life of the Jewish people. And because at the time, Christianity saw itself as a development of Judaism. It's a natural growth of Judaism. The fact that the temple no longer existed, it was a major problem at the time. So those two events, coupled with the fact that people who knew Jesus had died or are dying, there was an interest in writing down these stories, these oral traditions, so that they could carry it on for the community. There is very little evidence as to who these gospel authors were. You know, we say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The names on those gospels were added very, very late. So tradition tells us that the first gospel was written by John Mark. Now, in the ancient world, if you were Semitic, you had two names. You had a Jewish name, Semitic name, and then you had a Roman name. So John was the Jewish name or the Semitic name of this individual by tradition, and Mark was his Roman name. Tradition tells us that he was Peter's assistant. Tradition tells us that he did know Jesus. We can't prove any of this. We don't even know if this individual, who could have been among the followers of Jesus, and he would have been a very young follower, because by the year 70, let's say that he was born in the year 10, give or take. You know, he'd be in his 60s. He'd be an old man by those standards. There's no way of knowing if this was actually the person. But whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark was an extremely intelligent individual, an extremely faith-filled individual, and wrote his gospel trying to develop some themes to help the community in Rome at the time deal with the crisis that they were after. There are some interesting themes that come out of Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel starts right at the top with the word arche, beginning. Now, what's interesting about that is that harkens back to the Old Testament, to the beginning, the first words in Genesis. It also looks forward to John's gospel, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Anointed One, the Son of God. That's the first line in Mark's gospel. And the gospel then proceeds in two major, or three if you count a little section in the center, of a way of proving that beginning statement. So the whole first part of the gospel, you think of Mark's gospel as a big X. So it comes down to the center, and then goes out again this way. And so the first part of the gospel talks about everything that one needs to know or should know at the time about Jesus the Messiah. At the middle point of the gospel, Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi with his apostles. And he turns to his apostles and he says, who do you think I am? And Peter says, you are the anointed one, the Son of God. Everything in the gospel to that point brings us to that revelation of Peter. Now, right after that, Jesus cures a blind man. Now, what's interesting about this cure is that the cure doesn't take the first time. Remember that story. The blind man, Bartimaeus, and he's blind for birth, and Jesus makes some spittle, he puts it on his eyes, and he can see, but it's very cloudy. He can't see very much. And then Jesus says a few words, he prays again, and then the man can see fully. That's a turning point in the gospel from a literature or form standpoint. Because what Mark is saying is that everything you've seen so far, you've seen through foggy lenses. From this point on, I'm going to show you how to see through clear lenses. And at that point, the passion narrative starts. And Mark's point is that the way of the Christian, at least for his community, when he's talking to his community, is that the suffering and death that was endured by Jesus are the lot to be endured by Christians. And that is the way. Now, where did Mark get his material? Well, we know that we had all these oral traditions. And if indeed he was Peter's assistant, a good deal of his preaching would have fallen on Mark. Mark would have made notes. We know that there were other gospels besides the ones that we know in existence at the time. We have no record of them. We just have hints of them. So it's very possible that Mark had written material to work from as well. But what's clear in Mark's gospel, when you read it in the Greek and you look at it very carefully, what Mark has done is taken dozens and dozens of stories and kind of stitched them together to create a narrative. And he creates the narrative with his theological point of view in mind. I'm not going to get too deep into the theological narrative, but just sort of just say that that most scholars agree that Mark was the first real written gospel. It was written in Rome. It was written in Greek. It was written in a Greek that we call koine. Koine is a Greek word meaning common. So it's a very different Greek than you would find in Homer or that you would find in Sophocles or the playwrights. It's the Greek that would be spoken every day on the street. It wasn't slang, but it was common. The other thing that's interesting about Mark's Greek is that it's somewhat rough. It's clearly that this is probably he's fluent in it, but it's not his original language. He's also talking to people in Rome, and he's talking to people who do not fully understand the Jewish environment. So he takes time to both use Latin words, which is kind of interesting, because he's speaking to an audience that's in Rome whose primary language is Latin. Although the lingua franca at the time was this Koine Greek. And he spends a lot of time explaining Jewish customs. So just by analyzing the text, we can get a lot of information about what's going on there. After Mark's gospel, around 70, sometime in the next 20 years, so somewhere between 70 and 90, Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel appear. Now, interesting, Matthew and Luke, and again, I can't get into too deep into the amount of time that I have, but Matthew and Luke have Mark on their desk. And they use Mark as the template. If you compare the Gospels together, almost 90% of the structure and order of Mark is mirrored in both Matthew and Luke. So they have, so they're aware of Mark's gospel, but they're writing their own gospel. We're not sure whose was written first, Luke's or Matthew's. I kind of think Matthew's. It's really not important, because what's interesting is that they didn't know each other, and they had no knowledge of what each other was doing. How do we know that? We know that by internal linguistic analysis and by comparison of events in the Gospels. If they were comparing notes, there are a lot of things that are very different that wouldn't be different in the two Gospels. As I said before when I talked, Matthew is writing to a Jewish community that's become Christian, probably in Antioch or Ephesus, so somewhere in Asia Minor, on the coast of Turkey. And Matthew goes out of his way to present Jesus as the new Moses. He is the new bringer of religion, of faith. Matthew's gospel, and as I remember, Mark's gospel is a narrative that comes into an X up to the point of Revelation and then through the Passion. Matthew's gospel is structured in 5 sermons to parallel the 5 books of the Torah. So when we think of the Sermon on the Mount, most people just think of the Beatitudes, and think that Jesus went up on the mountain and said 8 Beatitudes and that was it. No. The Sermon on the Mount goes on for about 3-4 chapters in Matthew's Gospel. It's a long, long discourse. So there's some introductory material. I'll talk about the infancy narratives in a second. The first long discourse, a bridge of some activity that follows Mark, a second long discourse, a bridge of activity, a third long discourse, etc., to get 5 long discourses. And everything that Matthew does, tries to reinforce that Jesus is the Messiah, the one who was promised. Luke, and we have no idea where Luke wrote his gospel. Again, we're using these names commonly because of tradition, because we have to say we don't know actually who wrote these. I would guess that Luke wrote his gospel probably at Alexandria, from my opinion, if I were to guess. And Luke's gospel is actually 2 books. You cannot look at the Gospel of Luke without looking at the book of Acts at the same time. They are 2 chapters in a long book. And Luke is writing to a Hellenistic community. Think of it this way. Luke is writing to the people in Wyckoff and Franklin Lakes. These are people who are more well off. They're wealthy, they're looking for faith, and he is somewhat of an apologist as well. Now, the Romans, when they took over a country, they did what they could to wipe out the religion in the country. The only time that they wouldn't do that if they encountered a religion that was extremely ancient. So when they hit Judea, when they hit Palestine, and hit the Jewish religion, that was a very, very ancient religion. It's one of the reasons they let it continue, because they were superstitious, they were a little terrified of ancient religions. But Christianity was a new religion. It just popped up. So another reason it had to be wiped out, within the Roman mindset. Luke spends a great deal of time in his gospel trying to demonstrate that Christianity is just Judaism come to its fulfillment. So he's doing a good deal of apology in his gospel as well. Now, we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptic gospels. Synoptic is a Greek word meaning with one eye together. In other words, you can put the gospels. This is a text I use for study. If you put the Gospels side by side, particularly with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you can see that there is a great deal of similarity at the same time through the Gospels. And the reason for that is because both Matthew and Luke have Mark's Gospel as their framework. So they're following Mark's Gospel. Matthew and Luke also have a document that doesn't exist today, but there is enough linguistic evidence to indicate that it did exist at Rotary, called the Q document. Now, the Q document was not a narrative. It wasn't a gospel narrative as we understand Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it was just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. This is a academic reconstruction of the Q document. And we know that the Q document was followed a little more faithfully by Luke than it was by Matthew. But you can imagine the amount of scholarship work that went into reconstructing that. So that's the reason that Matthew, Mark, and Luke look so much alike, is because they're using Mark as their basis, and they're using Q for the sayings of Jesus to incorporate into their Gospels. What's interesting is that the sayings are close enough between Matthew and Luke, but not always exactly the same, which is kind of interesting. Matthew and Luke also had other material with them. There were obviously either stories or written accounts going around that we indicate as infancy narratives. Mark does not talk about the infancy of Jesus. Mark's gospel starts immediately with Jesus being baptized. Matthew and Luke start with infancy narratives. Now, here's some, we've just been through the Christmas season. Here's some interesting questions. Where did Joseph and Mary live before Jesus' birth? We have Nazareth. Anyone else?
Nazareth. Yeah.
Okay. According to Luke, they lived in Nazareth. According to Matthew, they lived in Bethlehem. They had a house in Bethlehem. They didn't travel any place before Jesus' birth. Okay. We have a problem. Matthew has a problem. Matthew wants to see Jesus as the new Moses. And he knows that the new Moses, the Messiah, has to come from the line of David, and he has to come from Bethlehem. So he puts Joseph within the line of David, and the whole beginning of Matthew's gospel, which everyone kind of, their eyes glaze over, they don't read it, talks about the whole genealogy from the beginning of time, to Jesus' birth. If you analyze that genealogy and count the genealogy, and then translate that count into Hebrew words, it spells David. So Matthew, again, everything in his gospel is focusing on that. So Matthew has Mary and Joseph living in Bethlehem. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and there are no shepherds. There's no angels. What's in Matthew's gospel is the revelation to the Magi and the star. Matthew has to get Jesus from Bethlehem to Galilee. So he does it by bringing Jesus down into Egypt, so like Moses, he can leave Egypt and come up into the promised land. And they go to Galilee to get out of the territory ruled by Herod, because Herod is out from the story, obviously, to kill Jesus. In Luke's gospel, Jesus, Mary and Joseph do live in Nazareth, and they come down to Bethlehem based on this census that Luke talks about. Historically, we can find no evidence of a census. So this is obviously something that Luke made up. Luke also has his chronology a little bit screwed up. The Quirinius was not the governor at the same time that Herod was the king. Herod died about 4 BC. Quirinius wasn't the governor until about 6 AD. So, Luke doesn't have all of his facts together, but they're working with different infancy narratives that they're incorporating in their gospel for their theological purposes. Interesting thing about Mark, there is no resurrection story in Mark's gospel. You say, well, wait a minute, yes there is. I'll get my gospel out. I'll read it to you, I'll show you. Well, that was a much later edition. What's interesting is that in the 1800s, in the 1840s, and the 1890s, a number of manuscripts were discovered that were much more ancient than the manuscripts that were used for the scriptures up until that time. Right now, the earliest manuscript that we have of the Gospels is around middle 300s AD. Before that, it was like 500s, 600s. And what was interesting is when they discovered these manuscripts, which had a much more ancient tradition, there were things missing that were in the later manuscripts. And one of them was the resurrection story in Mark. So historically, Mark's gospel ends with the empty tomb. The women come to the tomb, they find it empty, and they run away, not wanting to tell anyone because they were full of fear and trembling. That's the end of the gospel. That's created a number of scholarship issues, and maybe at another time I can talk about that. John's gospel is totally different than Matthew, Mark. John's gospel probably wasn't written in its final form until around 110 AD. And obviously it was not written by John, the beloved disciple, at that point. There's evidence, there's linguistic evidence in the gospel that there's probably 3 authors or 3 editors. The last editor bringing it all together around 110 AD. Other interesting things that come to light when you get to these ancient manuscripts. Everyone remembers the story about the adulterous woman, right? So the woman was accused of adultery. She's dragged out in the city, and there she's about to be stoned. And the Pharisees, to test Jesus, says, this woman was caught in adultery. What should happen? And Jesus doesn't say much. He starts writing on the ground and says, those of you without sin, cast the first stone. And they all sort of disappear. And he says, where they all go? The woman said, they've left. He said, well, I don't condemn you either. Go and don't sin anymore. Very important part of the gospel today, it was never part of the gospel. It was, it's both linguistically and structurally, it's a later addition. Probably, maybe after the edition of the editor was finished in around 110. Doesn't mean it's not important, doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means from my point of view as an academic scholar, that there are the development of the Gospels continue on until they get to some kind of final form in the 300s. So with that, there's a lot I could talk about, but maybe it might be more fun just to field some questions.